What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a bit of a catch up with this. This is one of AMD's very first generation RDNA graphics cards. No, it's not the RX 5700 XT. That is one that we've looked at before and it's an amazing graphics card. This is actually its younger sibling, the RX 5600 XT. And I've been looking forward to taking a look at one of these for a while now, and I've finally managed to get my hands on one. So the Radeon RX 5600 XT. Now this was a graphics card that I did have an opportunity of purchasing way back in 2020 when I was actually getting into PC gaming or getting back into PC gaming, but instead I chose the 5700 XT purely because I wanted something that would last, and of course that card lasted quite a while. And this one I kind of avoided because I didn't hear very good things about it, but I've now managed to get one, and to be honest it was reasonably cheap. Way back when AMD was just repeating themselves with the Polaris graphics cards, releasing the RX 480, the RX 580, which were just pretty much the same cards with a little bit of change, but you didn't really get much more for your money. They then actually released these, and they released them on a brand new architecture, and that architecture was of course RDNA. Now of course with a brand new architecture came brand new problems. There were issues with drivers with both this one and the 5700 XT, but over time they managed to fix them all out, and of course now when we're looking at it all the way up in 2023, a lot of those issues are going to be fixed. So the test results that we're going to show today are pretty much how this card stands right now. I don't actually know a lot about the RX 5600, but if we take a look at some of their specs on the AMD website, we can see that it currently has 36 compute units, a boost frequency of up to 1560 MHz, and a game frequency of 1375 MHz. It has 64 ROPS and of course a typical board power of around 150 watts, which is actually quite impressive for any graphics card nowadays, considering that a lot of the new modern ones are actually using a lot of power. It also comes with 6 GB of GDDR6 memory, which okay is going to be touch and go nowadays, particularly with some of the more modern titles, and I'm sure in our benchmarking we'll see exactly what that means. But with a memory interface of 192 bits and a memory bandwidth of up to 336 GB, it doesn't actually affect the card as much as you would think. Now the model that I did manage to get my hands on is of course the MSI Mech OC version. I'm not actually a big fan of those versions of cards. I think they do cut down quite a bit. You don't get a very good shroud. You don't get things like 0 fan speeds, which is slightly annoying if you don't like the noise of fans. Sometimes I like it when the card isn't doing anything to just have the fans stop, because there's obviously no point running them at all and creating the extra noise. But it does come with a few features that I could not miss. Of course, it has to come with a backplate. Now this backplate on this card is actually just plastic. It's not a metal one, but it does make the card look a lot nicer when it's in a machine. It comes with an 8-pin power connection, which means you do need extra power to be able to run this. You can't just run it straight from the PCI slot. And to be honest, as far as temperatures do go with the cooling solution on this, it's not actually that bad. Now this card when I picked it up was absolutely filthy, so we did run into a few temperature issues, particularly when benchmarking it under some extreme and intense games. So what I did do is I actually tore it down and give it a bit of a clean up. I managed to replace the thermal paste on this. The pads were perfectly fine, they just needed cleaning, and the temperatures improved a lot. So if you are going to go purchase something of this age, and of course you're going to have to pick it up second hand now, make sure that you actually do give it a bit of a clean, change that thermal paste, and the card should be good to go. Now when these cards were released, they were released for around $280, which was extortionate at the time because it was effectively replacing the RX 560, and of course that price over the $99 RX 560 was a bit of a jump, but it was also a massive jump when it came to performance. It was so big in fact that AMD really just jumped up the tier system a little bit, so it's really difficult to kind of compare it to an RX 560. But of course, on their newer generations, at some point we could compare this to something like the RX 6600 XT, and we could tell how far the RDNA architecture has actually come. But for today, we're just going to be taking a look at this card, and I managed to pick this one up for just £100. Now, is that cheap? I don't know really. The performance of it is actually quite good, but I didn't purchase this card for gaming. I actually purchased it for my editing rig, so effectively it's not going to really be gaming, but of course on this channel we love to see how well things can game, so that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been benchmarking this now in our test rig for a while. That is an i7 12700K system with 16 GB of DDR4, so the card shouldn't actually be held back at all. We should have been able to get the full potential of it out on that system. So let's take a look at those benchmarks and we'll see how well it did. So as you can tell from those benchmarks, this card performed exceptionally well. So well, in fact, I was super surprised. The things that I'd heard about the RX 5600 XT actually put me off back in the day. I was told that it was a very underwhelming card that couldn't perform very well at all, and I was actually surprised at the results we got. Of course, when it comes to 4K results, the card is not a 4K card. We managed to struggle to get 60 FPS in anything, and particularly when we were running it in high settings. But of course, the card was never designed for that. We did manage to get an average of 52 frames per second in Back 4 Blood and an average of 65 frames per second in Doom Eternal. And Doom Eternal had pretty decent 1% lows, but they are the games that really do shine when it comes to older graphics cards. Everything else pretty much plummeted. When it came to 1440p, with a high quality setting on all the games, we actually saw very decent results. In Back 4 Blood, we managed to see an average of 92 frames per second, although the 1% lows on that game weren't that great. We managed to get an average of 128 frames per second on Doom Eternal, with fantastic 1% lows of 93. An average frame rate of 63 frames per second on God of War, which was fantastic because that game is actually really hard to run on most hardware. And then of course Spider-Man Remastered, getting an average of 70 frames per second with a 1% low of 39. Now, as long as your 1% lows are in that 30 range, the games tend to be quite playable, but of course you want that higher because it really shows the stability of the card. So to actually see if we could improve those kind of things, of course we took this card back to the resolution it was really designed for, which was 1080p. Now in 1080p, you got fantastic results across the board. We nearly managed to get 60 frames per second on all of the titles. For Back 4 Blood, we got 136 on average, which of course makes it more than playable, with a 1% low of 78. Doom Eternal, we managed to get 173 frames per second, with a 1% low of 111, which is fantastic. God of War, an average of 86 frames per second, but again we did suffer a little bit on those 1% lows, only getting an average of 44. Again, that did mean that the game was more than playable, there wasn't any major stuttering, so I kind of class that as a win for that. Red Dead Redemption 2 was obviously one of the oldest games that we tested, and we managed to get an average of 73 frames per second with a 1% low of 52, which is still great and more than playable. Spider-Man Remastered, dropping down to 1080p, managed to increase up to 89 frames per second, and we did manage to improve those 1% lows a little bit, getting an average of 52. Now the two games that really stood out as poor performers here were of course Cyberpunk 2077, only managing to get an average of 57 frames per second with a 1% low of 47. And then of course The Last of Us Part 1, the game that destroys most hardware, only managing to get an average of 51 frames per second with a 1% low of 43. Now again, that does mean that the game is more than playable, but it wasn't a great experience, particularly at that kind of resolution. Overall, we can see a mixed bag of results, with some of the more optimized games getting pretty high and decent frame rates pretty much at all resolutions. But then those newer titles that really do test even the more modern kind of graphics cards, the RX 5600 XT really did struggle, and to be honest, a lot of that was because of the VRAM. Now the VRAM in this card is only 6GB, and for games such as Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Last of Us Part 1, we did see a lot of VRAM warnings, particularly when running it in the higher settings. But of course now it's 2023 and we do have some options, so what we wanted to do was try to get The Last of Us Part 1 hitting that magical 60 frames per second, and to do that we had to do some tweaking to the settings. If we were to take The Last of Us Part 1, reduce the resolution down to a 1080p with a medium setting, and then enable AMD's FSR 2.1 to a quality setting, we actually managed to get the game to hit that magical 60 FPS. That was actually quite fantastic, although you did take a little bit of a sacrifice on the game's quality, but it really did actually drop those VRAM warning issues. They completely went away and the game actually played fine. Now some would say that The Last of Us Part 1 is actually a very unoptimized game, even still now with its updates. So to be able to prove this, we tried another game from 2023, one that we have tested before on the channel and one that was well optimized even when it was released, and that game of course is Dead Island 2. Dead Island 2 run beautifully on this card, where it only really struggled to get any kind of decent performance in 4K, which of course the card is not a 4K card, so we can kind of forgive it for that. And we saw some great results. In 1080p we managed to get an average of 92 frames per second with a 1% low of 43. In 1440p we managed to get an average of 49 frames per second with a 1% low of 25, and then of course at 4K we only managed to get an average of 28 frames per second with a 1% low of 13. The 4K results, as I've said before, we should ignore because this card is just not suitable for that kind of resolution, particularly with these super modern games. but for the other two resolutions, it played perfectly fine. You could hit that magical 60 FPS in 1440p with a slight tweak to the settings. You didn't really need FSR or anything like that, which to be honest means if you are actually using a 5600 XT, you can actually get away with playing a lot more modern games. You may have to sacrifice some settings, but of course this card is now 3 to 4 years old, so you're going to expect that, particularly when even more modern cards are actually requiring that too. So should you actually go out and buy an AMD Radeon RX 5600 XT? Well, actually it makes a fantastic budget graphics card. Because it is a Radeon 5000 series graphics card, you get access to all of the latest tools from AMD, your FSRs and even your RSRs, which means you can actually run upscaling technologies on pretty much any game. You don't actually need FSR to be able to do it. We have done a video of that in the past, so we'll make sure we link it at the end if you have one of these cards and you want to know how to get those free FPSs out of it. And for just £100, which you can easily pick these up for now, I think they make a great option. Of course, I've not bought this one for gaming. It is going into an editing rig, and that machine is not going to be doing any gaming at all. It's literally going to be editing the videos for you guys. So I'm not going to really see the kind of performance, but it has made me really super keen and interested in checking out some of their other ranges. Of course, we've looked at the RX 5700 XT in the past, and I think I might try to get hold of just a standard RX 5700 or maybe even the RX 5500 XT, because I'd heard bad things about that one too, and if this one shocked me, maybe that one will too. But you let me know in the comments below, which one do you want us to look at next? Do you want us to try and find an RX 5500 XT? It's an even more budget card, but can it actually perform as well? I don't know. Or would you like us to stick to the more higher end, even though they are technically budget cards now, the RX 5700? Also let me know down below, do you have an RX 5600 XT and what kind of performance are you getting out of it? Are you still sticking to it, or are you looking to upgrade now? I don't think that many that are purchasing these or probably purchased these in the past really need to look at an upgrade yet, although I'm sure maybe my mind will be changed once I start comparing this to some of the more modern generations. I do hope that AMD will come out with an RX 7600 XT, because that could make a good pairing or a good competition for this, and see how far they've come in 2 generations of RDNA. But as always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, and I'm sure we will catch you in the next one.